I would like to welcome you to the Controversial Black TED Talks, which are the first in the series of controversial blackness events taking place this February. Throughout the fall quarter, we planned, debated, and discussed how we wanted controversial blackness to look this year, and we formulated a definition to guide our work. Controversial blackness is intellectually irredeemable and disreputable. It disrupts the normative discourses of racial respectability and racial uplift that surround politics, culture, and the academy simply because it can. It interjects from and into the margins, polemics, and indecorous texts of African American studies, problematizing and radicalizing its conceptual limits. By staging these interjections, controversial blackness explores and exposes the unsettled tensions and unaccountable conventions of African American studies, returning it to the facts of blackness with uncomfortably new ways of seeing, hearing, touching, and questioning its forbidden territories. So tonight you will hear 3 talks, each developed through individual research and collaborative discussion, and following each talk there will be a short question and answer period. So without further ado, Paul Jackson will introduce and start his talk.
Hi, I'm Paul Jackson, and I'm here to talk about nigger. Madness, person, the body. I'm here to tell you what nigger is and what it does. I'm here to tell you how its lexical repression, its enforced absence to erasure from our language, reveals its presence everywhere in our society. Nigger is not just unspeakable. It is that which makes the unspeakable unspoken. Nigger is hidden as an obscenity in Western modernity. Justice is impossible for black bodies. Black bodies cannot attain justice in Western modernity. But not only that, they should not want justice. At least not the justice that Western society offers. But what then? What do we do if justice is not only impossible, we don't want it? Dismantle, dissettle justice, and even make room for that which is thought commonly as unjust. Black liberation must oppose what is just. I'm here to convince you, essentially, that for black bodies, justice is a colonial conundrum. Dominated if you do, dominated if you don't. You don't believe me? Fine. Let's talk about justice. What is it? What is it actually? And what about it? Well, conventionally, and let's say conventionally, religiously, or morally speaking, is influenced by, let's say, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and Aristotle, and the various oldest magnates, and magna, whatever. Justice is giving everything what it is due, setting everything right, straight, take that word as you will, treating everything as it deserves to be treated. Now, I could make a case that justice is racist based on those very definitions, that justice categorizes things and then treats them that way consistently without fail. But I'm willing to go further and show you that justice is even more than these 3 problems as it is conventionally defined. Justice isn't just. Justice is what power says is just. It's not a solution to injustice. Justice is a solution to madness. Anything that is chaos, insanity, anything that's unknown, abnormal, the different. Justice is the maintenance of order, normality, sanity, safety, comfort. It's what one thinker, Michel Foucault, calls governmentality. That is, the mentality of government, the conduct of conduct. So madness, then, is central to the person, to the conception of the person. See, when a body can control itself and move at its own will, It is a person. And the thing that's controlling it is a person. But the person is more than that. The person is an ideological tool in Western modern politics that convinced you that you're controlling yourself. And sanity, the conduct of conduct, telling you how to conduct yourself when you're in line with conduct, and how conduct conducts itself. Sanity is how the government uses your idea of a sane self or a sane person to control you. So it gives you something that sells you that it makes you free, but then it tells you exactly how you should go about being free. Think about that. But not only is madness central to the person being central to government, nigger as a concept is central to madness. There's no madness in Western modernity without this image of the nigger. So the nigger then, it is madness or insanity defined. When early thinkers were thinking about exactly how they were going to get people to agree to politics and to enter into this governmental arrangement, formation, society, they had to paint pictures of chaos, primitivity, barbarism, murder. Some called it the state of nature, anarchy. In so doing, they essentially had to use examples for people. In their texts, you read Kant, Hobbes, Locke, even Rousseau, Adam Smith even, an economist. They have to give you examples. Look to Africa. Look to the Americas. They don't have government, and look at them. They're savages, niggers. This was the first imagination, the first introduction that the West had to racial others. They say the first impression is the most important one. Now, how can we be sure? Well, what does all this really look like if I'm making my case? And then what then? What do we do? Justice is impossible. Well, I suggest, in the irony of saying this at an institution, that we move beyond institutions and institutionalized formations. We have to depart from justice to critique it, depart from the arenas of civility where conduct is conducted. We have to venture into the madness which is always already present in justice. If you don't think justice is mad, observe riot police every once in a while, and I'll show you. We have to move beyond even academia, which is justified as a dominant force in thought. Even academia filled with black bodies. Approach the unjust, the obscene, and the normal, and the mad. We find the black entrapped in the white, both bodies and spaces and times. I am going to try to get you and introduce you to and turn you towards what I call decolonial epistemologies, epistemologies which are at the margin, which have been excluded for the very reason that they tell the truth, that they expose the truth. Why beyond the institution, though? Why can't the institution, sort of get radical? Why can't the institution talk about nigger? Why can't the institution expose the institution? Well, because politics, which is what this governmental formation, this society that we live in, politics is beyond institutional. That's what it does. Politics reaches from within to the beyond. Politics is how you govern things that are not political. It's popular culture. That's what the birth of modern politics is. It's the birth of popular culture. Everyone can participate. Everyone has ideas. Everyone's in the conversation. Therefore, everyone is political. And it wasn't necessarily always so, even though it was. So all these things like rhetoric and debate and consensus, those are political. And those things don't take place in the hallowed halls of academia alone. They're on TV, media, music. They're in philosophical ideals of freedom and liberty. Morals, the way we live our lives, the way we conduct our own conduct, literature, and even architecture. So the way a room is shaped can make an argument. But also because we know that institutions only get to be institutions if they follow certain rules. And a lot of us are probably guilty of that, all of us in our daily lives, following rules that do violence to our moral system. So my theoretical toolkit, as I said, my decolonial epistemology, I'm going to introduce you to them today. I won't dare do the injustice of trying to explicate all of their thought or even break them down or, mesh them. I'll show you some quotes, I'll show you some paintings, and I'll show how they're making the same case I'm making. But more importantly, I just want you to get used to them. Jean-Michel Basquiat, Carol Walker, Toni Morrison, Frantz Fanon, James Baldwin, also Jean Genet, but he won't be in this display today. Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Naomi Baba, people I'm using to make my case. And here then is my argument with these thinkers. Basquiat is going to reveal the nigger, the concept of the nigger, the primitive, the savage, the thing that invites governance. Because in our governmental structure, right, if you can't control your body, which is what madness is, if you can't control yourself, you have to be governed. You're mad. You're insane. You're abnormal. You're chaos. And what then the concept of the nigger does is in the imagination for hundreds of years, which takes material form through various governmental practices like slavery. In the imagination, you are precluded from being able to govern yourself because, of course, you're not insane if you're an other body. No, you're the thing that defines insane. The only people who can be insane are white people who aren't being proper white people. White people who are acting like niggers. Uncivil. Out of control. Wearing dreadlocks. Being socialists. Right? No, the black body doesn't even get a chance to be insane. It's the reference point for insanity. Jean-Michel Basquiat is going to show how that tearing of the body before the body even arrived to this continent is an imaginative thing. But when something has total power over another thing, its imagination is the will to truth, the will to meaning, the will to power. That is to say, what a parent thinks is going to happen for a child is going to happen. That's why the imagination is important. Follow me there. Then Walker shows that very thing. What the condition this imagination produces look like. So Carol Walker is going to show you when people with power over other people think about these people a certain way, what happens to those people. Take a look with me here. Michel Basquiat working with the image of the boxer. I'm not going to be an art theorist, an art critic, and Lisa can come up here if she wants, but he's responding to a movement called primitivism, and he's sort of making a mockery out of it. He's really showing you the obscenity of the black body and white imagination. It's not this glorious, sweaty form that's boxing on TV. He's showing you how it is torn, ripped, maligned, savage, uncivil, barbarous. Famous Negro athletes. He's showing you it doesn't matter what kind of car you're compensated with, what house you have, this is who you are. This is all you'll ever be in that imagination. Now, we're entitled to have our own imagination. And I'm not by any means saying that everyone in this society has that imagination, but I'm saying that everyone in this society has that imagination. When you watch TV, when you see images, when you hear people talking. In this society, we're adjudicated on by a jury of our peers, some of whom have never met anyone who even looks like you, and the only thing they get about you, the information they get about you, is from TV. So you want to be mad about movies now, because when you're locked up, that's the information they have about you. And this is what he's showing. He has this painting called The Irony of the Negro Policeman, how he thought it was really ironic when his party got busted by a black police officer, and they didn't behave any differently than white police officers. Showing you, obviously, that skin doesn't mean anything about you, but showing that someone can really mute sympathy altogether. It means nothing. It's the irony of someone who governs other people with the imagination of society. how dangerous it is when you adopt society's imagination. Here's Kara Walker now showing what the imagination of those bodies, that crass, crude imagination, if you allow me to use those words, does to the black person. I'm not going to analyze this as an artist, but just notice the relationship here. This child killing a chicken. Notice the young black woman, and I don't know, the definition's not there, but it's clear that it's a young white boy in actual smock filleting him. Right? And then another fellow in another overcoat under someone's skirt while they're working. Someone being carried away. Do that. Take that. That's what happens to the body when there's no person acknowledged. It gets worse, but when there's no person acknowledged. Here, something a little bit more, I guess, explicit. There are return to Glacio. Cross is burning, madness. She wrote this about the, she painted this, drew this, about the Reconstruction being destroyed. Just when Americans thought justice was going to be produced for black persons, we were reminded, not just by the KKK, but by the government that had invited KKK leaders into the White House, how that was just a fluke, a hiccup. I mean, even the imagination of society can get crazy sometimes to think they would actually produce justice. They thought to themselves, what are we doing? That's silly. I want to just show that Toni Morrison here is going to talk about the conditions that are produced by the white imagination. By conditions, she means the psychic work that's done on somebody who's dominated, whose space is violated, whose body is violated. She does so from a racial perspective and a gender perspective. What happens when someone's person, or the person, the concept of allowing someone to be governed, which is already shoddy, is completely disregarded. She says, yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it. They don't love your eyes, they just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back, yonder they flay it. And oh my people, they do not love your hands, they only use it, tie, bond, chop off, and leave empty. I have to think about that. She says exactly what I'm saying here in this first instance. I'll let you read it and I'll sort of describe what I'm saying. White people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them to this place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them. This is the work of the imagination. This is the work of the imagination in philosophy, from the very start of Western modernity, when madness was defined in relation to the black body. That every person who read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness was going to then think that the heart of darkness was not a place, but a condition of being tied to the black body. This is Frantz Fanon's quotes. And he's talking about this colonial condition. He's talking about the conditions of being foreclosed forever in a space before you get there, and what it produces. He talks about post-traumatic stress disorder, the conditions that are produced by being in conditions. That's a double entendre. Conditions, the mental conditions that are produced when someone is put in conditions, just by the force of the imagination of the powers who tell you where to go, who bind you and chain you. Remember I said dominated if you do, dominated if you don't. Now this quote I have to just, let's read it together. You read the words and I'll read the words, because we really have to just let this sit. James Baldwin, No Name in the Street. This is the book that I pulled from. He's part of my decolonial epistemology. I do not claim that everyone in prison here is innocent. But I do claim that the law, as it operates, is guilty. and that the prisoners therefore are all unjustly imprisoned, as any Mexican, and Puerto Rican, any black man, any poor person. Ask the wretched how they fare in the halls of justice, and then you will know, not whether or not the country is just, but whether or not it has any love for justice, or any concept of it. Ignorance, allied with power, is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And isn't this the argument that I'm making? That when someone has the power not to encounter you, not to share space on equal terms. I heard people talk about third spaces. Not to share your space on equal terms, to learn about you on equal terms. When they're allowed to just stand at a distance and look at you, to wonder what's in the black house, right? Not go in, just wonder. And then they can make decisions from any position of power, whether SAFC, Senate, I don't care, name it. They get to make decisions about what goes on then in that black house, what gets funded in that black house. They've never been. Consider that. This is ignorance allied with power. This is the impossibility of justice. It's just a causal relationship. And I'm wrapping up with this, with these final thoughts. Imagination, by which whiteness conducts its own behavior in relation to others. So how to be proper and civil, not primitive, right? How to be white. And then the conditions that others are placed in by their institutions without any research or going to talk to them or, hey, how's it going, And then the conditions which are produced by those conditions. This is the colonial conundrum, right? The colonial catch-22, if you will. Even a guy, I don't know if you've met him. I've never met him, but I read his work. Barnor Hesse calls the self-fulfilling prophecy of racism. It's when something can not only predict, but then make it so. And it does so, the prediction is almost a mockery. Because it tells you as if it doesn't know what's going to happen, then it makes it happen. We're being mocked. And I close. The only justice which Western society then comes with insulting, demeaning, colonizing conditions of assimilation, wherein you can only get justice if you imitate the behavior that is acceptable. The behavior which is defined by not you, by not being you, by being something that isn't you. If you can do that, you can have a little justice. They may as well tell us to go to Mount Olympus and bring back 2 acai berries. This justice makes us accept the truth that white behavior, white conduct, or acceptability before white eyes, or eyes acting on behalf of white eyes, is superior to one's own personal way of being, one's comfortable way of being. Not necessarily black, just your way of being. Remember, we're not talking about any real way of being, but you have to defy a way of being that was imagined about you that you probably are not. That's a task, right? You have to beat someone with impressions of you that you didn't know they had. You've had that happen to you, right? You didn't know someone was mad at you and you still had to make them happy with you? It's kind of crazy. But then from time to time, they'll ask us to be black, just so society can be reminded once again how civil it is, how far it's come. This nigga culture in hip-hop. Industrialized rap music. I'm not saying I avoid the word nigger, clearly. BET. These places where blackness then is sort of just a game, just to remind us how civil we are and control we are. And then we're compensated for our troubles. Sometimes given departments, and money, and all these other things. We have to remember, even as we're here, doing work, that we return to give them back their own problem. James Baldwin said, I give them back nigger. I make them face their own obscenity. They're trying to silence me with the word nigger. So I will speak it back. So that they first even have to confront the fact that they're trying to silence me. When we do that, justice won't be necessarily possible. Not the justice we know. But at the very least, we'll have to confront the fact that justice, if it's going to exist at all, has to make room for the very thing sometimes that it thinks is necessarily unjust. I'm going to leave it for my friend Amrit Trewn.
Hello, my name is Amrit Trewn, and my presentation today is titled End of Blackness as We Know It, Multiracialism, Post-Racial Fantasy. Mixed-race subjects, interracial sex, and race mixing today pose a bigger racial problem than they did in the past. Today we face a more pernicious threat to the fight for racial equality, social justice, and racial deconstruction. And that threat, that prohibiting force, is so well concealed, so well masked, that we are yet to recognize its enormous potential to undo the work done by radical black and feminist politics, which have fought so valiantly against structures of difference and equality and white supremacy. And that is the threat of multiracialism. It appears in front of us as a post-racializing project that will project us into a raceless future. I'm here standing in front of you to tell you that multiracialism in its current form seeks to do something quite different than post-racialized America. It seeks to do something a little bit more pernicious and harmful. It seeks to move into a post-black society, a society in which blackness no longer exists, or at least is no longer relevant. You're probably sitting in your seats wondering, what is this guy talking about? Why is multiracialism a problem? If anything, it seems quite progressive. Let me be clear, I'm talking about multiracial advocates, those who think interracial sex is progressive, and mixed-race bodies appear raceless. Let me share an experience I had just down the street at Philly's Best Restaurant last spring. I quote, "You know how we're going to solve America's race problem? My suggestion, everybody fuck everybody," end quote. Those words are etched to my memory, spoken by a stranger at a late night discussion as we all sat around watching Anderson Cooper's special titled Race in America. How fascinating. Only weeks later, after sharing this experience with a colleague of mine, she responded something along the lines of, "You know what? That's a great idea. I'm going to start trying that out." You see, we talk about interracial sex and mixed-race people as if they are living, real, unproblematic, unbiased proof that we are moving towards a better, more progressive, dare I say, more post-racial society, towards a society in which race would no longer matter. All you do is open up the latest Vogue or Time magazine to notice the shifting views locating beauty within that multiracial, archetypal female body with their darkened skin revealing a sort of sexy, exotic mystique, but not too dark to be misconstrued as really another brutish black body. More particularly, the more progressive, supposedly progressive among us, love gazing at the interracial relationship, framing the couple as finding a love so high, that it transcends racial fetishes, perverseness, racial fascinations, a history of sexual racism. A love that is free of racialization and racial difference. It's this all too familiar discourse, this all too familiar neoliberal discourse that emphasizes choice and freedom over structures and barriers. But interracial sex and mixed-race subjects come to the forefront of our attention at very particular historical moments, more specifically at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries. At the turn of the 20th century, it emerges in the form of the mulatto, the progeny of that also undesirable and deviant sex between the white and the black. Interracial sex and the mixed-race subject in this moment are highly contentious racial problems for our society. Yet then the mulatto disappears into thin air. And at the turn of the millennium, the mixed race subject reemerges as a new, unique, progressive racial phenomenon. It reemerges as a millennial multiracial, with no trace of historical connection to the mulatto-mulatta. Today, I will convince you that adhering to these discourses, which celebrate multiracialism as a way past race and racial difference, will take us into a future where race is still a thing, but blackness is not. That is to say, multiracialism is potentially a eugenics project that does not seek to get past race, but past the problem of race, blackness. Blackness that reminds you of slavery, racism, subordination, exploitation, expropriation, dehumanization, historical and contemporary moments. Hold on, rewind, and pause. How was a mixed race subject a problem in the past? In the 1800s, race theorists as famed as Charles Darwin and Robert Knox, well, they located the racial in the natural world and argued for the existence of this sort of racial purity. Right? To be more blunt, these pseudoscientific theorists were arguing in terms of protecting white purity, protecting whiteness. Races were supposed to be separate sexually and socially and spatially in order to protect the integrity of white race. Yet in the face of on-the-ground interracial sex, these discourses of race mixing were constructed in order to reinstate these false notions of racial purity and integrity. In spaces where racial integrity and purity never existed in the first place. According to these theorists, race mixing leads to racial impurity, moral degeneracy, sexual impotency. Race mixing was a wrong against Mother Nature, a crime against humanity, a sin against the racial gods. And we see the adoption of this anti-miscegenation mentality most clearly in the lynching of black men who were accused of raping white women. Women often being deemed as the keepers of culture, the ones who give birth to the members of the race and the citizens of our nation. They are the symbols of the purity and impurity of the nation. This is why lynching of black men was deemed necessary as one of the ways to socially prevent a mixing of the races, and specifically prevent sexual assault on white women. When in fact, there was a psychosocial, physical assault on black men and women that was ongoing, but not relevant. In short, race mixing and mulattoes were disruptive to the naturalized U.S. monoracial order, a naturalized order that keeps whiteness separated from the rest, and particularly blackness. Separated in order to justify and conceal the fact that powerful position and ideological wealth of whites actually emerges from the direct exploitation of blacks and other minorities, but not from the purity. Yet, what if we switch the lens here a little bit? What if the heart of the problem lies not in how the mulatto is a disruptive figure, but is a redeeming figure? A figure that challenges the framework of racial purity as questions of material, ideological, and racial inheritance are race. Does that offspring of interracial sex get to inherit the privileges of whiteness, such as freedom, property? It was so important in this time that the legal structures dealt with mixed race subjects in order to protect the racial, socioeconomic, and political privileges of whites in a world where challenges to white purity were being constantly presented by the realities of race mixing. The legal regulation of interracial sex became viewed as necessary in response to challenges to the exclusivity of white privilege. These challenges were frequently brought to court by white men in union with black women. And reflect how miscegenation was a site of racial redemption, as such unions could have given blacks access to white privileges. However, by identifying their progeny as illegitimate, it effectively barred them and their black parents from access to privileges such as inheritance. The problem then in this historical moment is that interracial sex poses a theoretical poses a threat to the theoretical foundation of racial purity. racial order and white supremacy as well. This mulatto must be regulated because it threatens structures of inequality and difference by highlighting the power politics behind race theory and anti-miscegenation laws. Now let's fast forward to that oh so exciting and precarious moment, the turn of the 21st century, the turn of the millennium. Lots of questions, lots of concerns. Y2K, terrorism, global warming, and that so-called age of the multiracial. Just this past February, the Pew Research Center reported that 15% of all new marriages in the US in 2010 were between spouses of a different race. More than double the share in 1980. The 2000 census revealed that about 2.5% of the American population identified with 2 or more races. The millennium has been effectively deemed the age of the multiracial, as interracial marriage rates are soaring and multiracial bodies are popping up from the dark and hidden quarters and cracks of society. Yet this mixed race subject is apparently a different sort of racial phenomenon, separate from the mulatto. This millennial multiracial is discursively constructed by the media and political structures as not a problem, not a disruption, but rather as a symbol of how far we have come in the fight for racial equality. For example, as of 2000, the US Census now allows individuals to check all races that apply for one's racial identification. The implication of this being that you no longer have to be bound by a monoracial system of classification. We are more free to acknowledge our racial ambiguity than ever before. When asked, what are you? It is entirely socially acceptable to say, I'm mixed, or I'm black and white, or simply, I'm multiracial. In fact, that same Pew Research study concluded that progressive college-educated individuals are more likely to marry across lines, presumably because race is becoming less and less of a thing. Black studies scholar Michael C. Thorne writes about this so pointedly, I quote at length. We are in a new era sans racial determinants, and in this context, multiracial people embody a colorblind America where core values and personal desires are the norm, end quote. Or Danzy Sinza, in my favorite opening to a chapter, and on the screen. Strange to wake up and realize you're in style. That's what happened to me just the other morning. It was the first day of the millennium, and I woke up to find that mulattoes had taken over. They were everywhere, playing golf, running, the airways, opening restaurants, modeling clothes. The radio played a steady stream of Lenny Kravitz, Sade, and Mariah Carey. I thought I died and gone to Berkeley, but then I realized, according to the racial zodiac, 2000 is the official year of the mulatto. Pure breeds, at least the black ones, are out. Hybridity is in. America loves us in all our half-caste glory. The president even announced on Friday that beige will be the official color of the millennium. But this new, hip, cool, progressive, racially ambiguous post-racial symbol is certain to be distinguished from the mulatto. The mulatto is a problem. The millennial multiracial is a solution. The mulatto was the product of abnormal, unnatural sex God was sure to shake his finger at and say, no, 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 you fools. Whites to flower-lined beds and candlelit rooms, while blacks just stay within the Mollies and Abigail playing on the screens. The millennial multiracial, a gift from God, a magnificent and triumphant character, beating the odds of racial difference. This quickly emerging multiracial in its beautiful, exotic, nearing post-racial form serves as a redeeming figure, symbolizing a better future to come, one in which race plays less and less of a role. Yet there is an aspect of this multiracial which is largely missing from the discussion, largely ignored and unexplored. The racial and multiracial. You see, the popular discourse of multiracialism today construct an interracial relationship as triumphing over race and racial difference, celebrating interracial intimacy as post-racial. Yet they ignore how interracial relationships are often characterized by sexual perversion, fetishism, lust, power politics, and sheer racial fascination. As sociologist Calvin Hurton wrote so pointedly, racism infects not merely the economic, political, and social spheres, but demands the most intimate sexual feelings and behaviors of our lives. Racial hatred demands emotional involvement with the biology of black people. The first focus of racism is the physical body. It is sexualized hatred. So let me rewrite the history for you. First, race theorists used race mixing as an opportunity to construct whiteness as racially pure. Then anti-miscegenation laws institutionalized such theories and solidified white purity in our social structures. And now, since these institutionalized racist ideologies have psychosocial effects, interracial intimacy is everything but post-racial. This new age progressive millennium alteration does not threaten structures of racial inequality or difference. Rather, it is manipulated, twisted, and turned in order to hide them. So, mixed race subjects and interracial sex, still a problem, more so than in the past. What will happen if we continue to ignore the threat of multiracialism, which seeks to move us prematurely into a post-racial society? It most certainly will not move us into a post-racial society because it operates so firmly within the racial. But there's something else here, and that is that multiracialism is not concerned about moving past race at all. Take Generation Mix, for example. This social movement which pressured the U.S. Census Bureau to include a check all that apply option on the census. Let me draw the picture for you of this movement. White moms married to black men who wanted their black-ish kids to be able to acknowledge their whiteness for psychosocial reasons. Doesn't sound post-racial to me. So what is it that these multiracial advocates want? Let's examine the criteria for these interracial relationships which are being heralded as transcending over race and racial difference. There is certain politics of multiracialism in which some relationships are proper while others not so much. So racialization is inevitably a component of interracial intimacy, yet these discourses ignore it. For example, take representations of Asian women who are presented as loose in interracial pornography, and the transnational mail-order bride service hooking up white men with Asian women. These experiences of interracial sexuality are improper. They are seen as coloring and denigrating the realities of this interracial sexuality of the heights. They are denigrating the idea that interracial couples choose that high romantic love over structures of power and difference. So we must question this reduced structure of the interracial relationship that systematically ignores the process of racialization. That is to ask, why are there such intentional efforts to ignore the perverse racial psychological aspects of sexuality in order to save this sexuality of the heights? Why do we mark these racial and perverse representations of interracial intimacy as deviant and improper relationships? In a sense, the true, proper, and authentic relationship are those that are passing, meaning that they are not influenced by racial and sexual forces as far as we can tell. Interracial relationships in this structure work when they are not implicated in something unnatural. Race can add flavor and spice when at a proper degree of racialization, but what is the degree? Too much racialization and sexualization is overbearing. You need a proper balance of race, sex, as well as money and power in order to guarantee that these unnatural, abnormal, undesirable terms are manageable. A great example of this management of racialization, Black Americans and white Americans serving the Peace Corps abroad in sub-Saharan African nations. Why are they interested in dating at such high rates? What's going on here? One of my favorite academics, Jared Saxon, nails it down when he writes, Black and white Americans become legitimately attracted to one another because they are not the niggers that Africans are supposed to be. So long as U.S. blacks are deniggerized, the relationship among Americans is rendered permissible. These relationships work because the Black Americans are deniggerized in relation to the African with all its savagery, backwardness, and promiscuity. the racial stereotypes against the Black American are transcended, and the relationship works. Yet the relationship is really only passing as the racial and sexual components of it are not being examined because they are for clothes, for comfort, for love, for moral decency. The question then is, whose interests are served by portraying some relationships as proper and others as pathological? Since racialization is intimately tied to sexualization, these interracial relationships only pass when they are deracialized and asexualized. Yet this does not require movement away from normative whiteness, quite the opposite actually. After all, a white dude who loves to get down with a black woman has nothing but jungle fever, right? And that relationship is surely looked upon as too racial, too sexual, too perverse. This process of deracialization and asexualization requires a move away from blackness and its discomforting history of sexual racism. It reflects a sort of anti-black sentiment in favor of a normative white location. It's okay if a black elite SAE brother who attended boarding school and plays lacrosse dates an average-looking white girl. It's proper if he's not too black. It's proper if he's an honorary white. The relationship is acceptable only if it's between humans, yet white Americans fit this requirement as non-racial humans who just happen to have certain privileges. We must not be deceived by the post-racial framing of the proper interracial relationship, because every interracial relationship is implicated in the process of racialization and sexualization. We just must ask how and to what extent. So this positing of post-racial multiraciality is instead the positing of a post-black desiring. These anti-black discourses around multiracialism do not seek to move past race, rather they seek to move past race problem raised by blackness. And they're reflective of a post-black desire, a desire to move into a society where blackness and its realities of subjugation no longer matter, a society in which beige will be the new black, and whiteness, yeah, it will still be whiteness. So what do you get when you have a society of so-called progressives fantasizing about the supposed potential for multiracialism to project us into a post-racial future? You get the end of blackness as we know it. Thank you for listening.
So my talk today is on Black liberation and the human-animal binary. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between these categories of humanity and animality. Is that better? I'll button this. These categories of humanity and animality and their relationship to blackness. And I'm going to talk about their relationship to blackness by looking at two key texts of Black liberation by Frantz Fanon. So just first to demonstrate basically the important material intersections between race and species, I'm going to talk briefly about something that happened in the late 1970s in Northern California. Two white men went out to poach some deer, and failing to find any deer, they decided to look for some cow, and then failing to find any cow, they decided to, quote, get some dark meat. And they ultimately shot a deaf black man who was sitting on the railroad tracks. And what you see in this horrific, horrific murder is that the intersections between animality, humanity, race, and blackness have very, very material and violent intersections, and ignoring them can be very, very problematic. So first off, I'm going to go through a short history of ideas on these categories of the human and the animal, because the question needs to be asked when and why it became conventional to use these blunt, nominalized adjectives of the human and the animal. And what I'm pointing out here is that these adjectives and these categories are not sacred and they're not universal, and they're actually really, really contingent on Western modernity. And when you trace the history of the category of the human, which will then also dictate the category of the animal, what you find is that it's based in a European formation of aristocratic manhood that is coming out of the medieval Europe a little bit, but mostly out of the Renaissance ideas. And that is going to be paired with Cartesian dualism, coming from René Descartes in the 17th century, to really create and solidify the binary that we use today. So, first of all, in 15th, 16th, and 17th century Europe, wealthy white men, wealthy educated white men, decided that they wanted to reconstruct a literary lineage with classical Greek and Roman thinkers. And they did this by studying Greek and Roman texts and lifting their ideas out of them and applying them to their social life. And one of the main thinkers they drew from was Cicero, who had this idea of humanitas, which is actually where we get our term of the human, and is actually the term that these Renaissance white men used to call their whole movement of humanism. And for Cicero, humanitas basically meant something like literariness. And studia humanitas, so humanistic study, would basically be something like literary culture. What's also interesting is that Cicero in classical Rome had already posed this idea of literariness against veritas, which is something to do like wildness. So we're already seeing the way that literariness, the study of letters, literacy even, in a colonial context, is being posed against something that's wild or savage. And so what happens is liberal education, the idea of studying letters and studying text, basically becomes understood as humanizing men. You have already a gender category, already a category that is privative. And now what's happening is there's this idea that you can become a human. So humanizing is a process. Being human is not a given at birth in the way that we think about it today. And finally, what this also means is that language becomes the basic civilizing act that distinguishes man from beast. There's a really heavy emphasis on letters. Then what happens in the 16th century with Descartes is basically he has this idea that man has a rational soul and everything else doesn't. That was basically his landmark claim. And what he effectively did was create this category, the animal. Because before Descartes, you had men, and you had beasts of land, and you had fowl, and you had fish of the sea, and you had a really multi-species diverse landscape, even in European ideology. But what happens with Descartes is he decides that man is exceptional alone, based on rationality, and everything else, every other billions of species can be lumped into one category based on the fact that they're irrational, and they're just made of matter, they're just bodies. And this has a really close relationship to Descartes' day job as a vivisectionist, where he used to nail animals to boards and cut them open. And what he would say is that when they're crying out, that's not pain, that's just automatic, they're just machines. It's just an automatic response. And so man is being posed against what has been called the beast-machine doctrine, where animals are basically machines and men are rational souls. And this is where you see the idea of the human basically being solidified. Man, this idea of an aristocratic man is being pulled into the category of the human, and everything else is being pulled into the category of the animal as the human's necessary deficit, necessarily lacking the categories of the human. So this raises the question of whiteness, because if the category of the human was born by pulling these white, masculine, upper-class subjects, and then attaching it to Enlightenment rationality, the relationship to whiteness seems a little obvious, but also a little debatable. And furthermore, what is the relationship between this binary and race? Because we know that the ways in which Enlightenment rationality was used to justify colonization and enact racism. So, there are a few different strategies of going about this, of untangling the relationship between race and the human-animal binary. One of them is called species critique, which basically looks at the relationship between race and species, which are both two categories. They interestingly arise at similar periods. The problem with this strategy, though, is that too often race and species become conflated. So people understand race as just another way of saying species, or they take species as like the original prototype of oppression, where sort of racist oppression wouldn't have happened if hunting didn't already happen, for example. But what is interesting, and this does get at, is that there's a close relationship between early biological taxonomies, which articulated the first notions of species, and also race. So the ways in which human, what we call human today in the biological sense, bodies had been categorized into separate categories in these same taxonomies that had divided species. The other strategy is called Animalization Critique. And this basically critiques the ways in which racialized groups and racialized bodies are subjected through animal figures. So this is really looking at tropes, looking at literature and looking at film and looking at art in the ways in which animals have been used to figure and continually oppress racialized groups. So you have your typical examples of Brer Rabbit and Tar Baby or King Kong. The problem with animalization critique, though, is that you end up never actually talking about animals. And this should be pretty obvious in the fact that it's called animalization critique. So it's using that category of the animal, which had already collapsed millions of species into one homogenized category. And what ends up happening is you never actually talk about the gorilla or the rabbit who is underwriting this metaphor, and the actual animal disappears completely into a metaphor. Now, this may seem fine in a certain sense, but we'll see with the third strategy why it matters. The third strategy, which I think is the most compelling, is called doing ecologies of representation. So you have representations such as the gorilla, which has been used to represent both Irish bodies and black bodies historically. And ecologies of representation call for recognizing non-human species as companion travelers under imperial biopower and racism. So not only looking at the way that their bodies have appeared in human artifacts, such as film and art, but actually doing an ecology to see what is the ecological relationship between this metaphor and what's going on with the animal. And so for King Kong, for example, or the use of gorilla bodies, what you would have to interrogate is the ways in which British colonial animal welfare policy intersected with the primate trade, and the way that the primate trade then informed this representation of racialized bodies. But still we're left with the question of blackness, even if we do ecologies of representation. And we're wondering what is most specifically connecting blackness to the human-animal binary. And I'm going to ask that question and answer that question by looking at, like I mentioned, two key texts of Black liberation thinker Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, and the Wretched of the Earth. And what you see when you read these texts for categories of man, categories of human, and categories of animal, is that you see there's a kind of chaotic deployment, an implicit appropriation of the binary in some ways, in other ways, a sort of hesitancy with it, but still using its terms. And this deployment of the terms and this use of the categories of human and animal have real effects on the way that he theorizes Black liberation and decolonization. So first of all, when you read the text, what you see is that Fanon does recognize that the category of the human is contingent. It is not an ontological given. He articulates that man precedes the human, so we have a gendered, privative category already. And he articulates that becoming human is a social process of recognition. So he cites Hegel in doing this, and he owes a lot of debt to Hegel in using this, but he says man is human only to the extent to which he tries to impose himself on another man in order to be recognized by him. Which is interesting, and in some ways some could argue that he is kind of reevaluating or rearticulating what this category could mean. But the question still remains of what is the criteria for this recognition then? What counts? How can someone be recognized as human even if they exert themselves on another man? And when you read his text further, you see that his criteria is basically the Cartesian distinction. He's attached to this notion of human as rational opposed against animal. And he says all these psychoanalytic findings, so he's critiquing psychoanalysis, and all this research have a single aim, to get man to eradicate the narcissism whereby he thinks he is different from the other animals. All in all, I grasp my narcissism with both hands, and I reject the vileness of those who want to turn man into a machine. So machine and animal here are used in parallel senses, which we know comes directly from Descartes' articulation of an animal. And he also poses the animal directly as a deficit of the human, right? He says, I grasp my narcissism and reject those who want to turn me into a machine, and he rejects those who want to turn man into an animal. So he's basing his logic in this argument. What this means then for the way that he understands colonization is that for Fanon, dehumanization, which in the binary basically means the same as animalization, becomes to mean the same thing as colonization. He says European colonialist logic dehumanizes the colonized subject. In plain talk, he is reduced to the state of an animal. So we see that Fanon then, the way that he understands colonization is based in this Cartesian binary, based in this idea that you have a human first who is then reduced to the state of an animal. Which animal? Who knows? Just the idea of an animal. This is really interesting because the implications of this then are that a decolonizing politic for Fanon requires an aggressive humanization. He says being activists in a national party is not a question of politics, but the only way of casting off their animal status for a human one. So, for decolonization to occur successfully, to achieve some sense of liberation, there needs to be kind of an aggressive claiming of this category of the human. But considering the way that I've traced the binary thus far, and the binary's important implications in the ways that we understand race and species, the question that remains is claiming the category of the human really a mechanism of black liberation, or is it only a mechanism of assimilation and recolonization? Now, this gets really interesting because Fanon kind of discloses this in his text. He says, really, really interestingly, the problem we shall tackle in this chapter is as follows. The more the black Antillean assimilates the French language, the whiter he gets. In other words, the closer he comes to becoming a true human being. So in a certain sense, Fanon gets this. He connects becoming a true human being to becoming white. And yet at the same time, he's unable to release himself from the Cartesian binary that narrates basically his entire discourse. And as you can see, I mean, even in the way that I'm talking today, I'm using the term human, for example, and what I'm going to suggest is that part of the problem is we really don't have any other language, that it's nearly impossible to escape it, because we just have no other way to describe this collectivity of bodies that we need to use. However, things get really, really controversial, and the reason that people don't really like to talk about the categories of the human and its really co-constitutive relationship with that category of the animal is when you start talking about human rights, which has been a really, really popular rallying methodology for decolonizing activism, progressive egalitarianism in some cases, is the notion of human rights. And what some of my talk may suggest is that these rights that make up human rights may be simply, historically, the rights of a white, masculine, upper-class subject, and may not adequately address the rights that are needed by those who are colonized and oppressed. That's where it gets really controversial, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure if I think that these body of rights are the same as those historically for the white, masculine, upper-class subject. However, what I think is more compelling is that the terming of these rights as human rights really shows where the powers of signification lie. Who gets to name these rights human rights? Who is naming these rights human rights? And it's clearly coming out of Western modernity, where these rights attached to a subject that we know is historically bounded as white and male, these rights we're going to call human rights. And then you get to the interesting question of animal rights, which I'm not really going to bring up today because it's kind of brings you down a whole other path. But the question basically still remains of how do we craft different methodologies of liberation? How do we craft methodologies of liberation that don't force us to claim this category of the human, a category whose allegiance should not be taken for granted, considering the ways in which multiple racialized bodies and gendered bodies have been excluded from it, and how we craft different methodologies of liberation that attempt to situate blackness within a more diverse network of relations that constitute embodied experience, that don't reduce this network of relations to a simple human or human-animal relations. So that's the question that I'm going to leave you with today, and maybe you have some suggestions. Thank you. So we're going to take some questions now, a few questions, all three of us, at once, or I mean, individually.
So, fascinating presentation. Thanks for your really stimulating work and great presence as well. All of you have as presenters. Clearly well on your way to being high-powered intellectual. Great point. So, I guess I was wondering if you could say a bit about why you see blackness itself as somehow being displaced. Because it seems to me that blackness actually is, by the nature of its constitution, to sustain the construction of whiteness, is actually an essential domain for giving coherence to the idea of multiraciality. So could you say why you see multiracialism as displacing blackness? Because it seems like, based on what you told us, that one could conclude it actually is essential to giving a coherent set of meaning to multiracialism.
Absolutely. So the question is, how do I see multiracialism as a project that seeks to move past blackness, when historically, and if we even look how whiteness is constituted, it's often placed in relation to blackness. There's a certain relationship between the two. And even in my analysis, I go to the point of saying that, well, there's a target of blackness. It's certainly in the equation. So when I talk about blackness, or I talk about multiracialism being a post-black desiring, what I mean is to start with the assumption that is multiracialism really a post-racial project? Is the goal of multiracialism to move us into a society where race doesn't exist anymore? And through, it's pretty easily found that, no, it's clearly not. Race is certainly in the equation. Race is often the target in a lot of ways. So when I call it a post-black desiring, I said it in two ways. I said either moving to a society where black no longer exists, or is no longer relevant. And the idea is that multiracialism as a project which seeks to be constructed in this kind of vein of post-raciality is really trying to distance itself from a history of sexualization, sexual racism, a history of rape in the colonial context, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the history that is tied to blackness. That's history. So that's why we can't have the proper relationship right, because you can't be constantly reminded that when you're dating this, when you're white and dating a black person, that there's a history tied to this relationship that I am situated in. So perhaps it's not necessarily a post-black in the sense of it no longer will exist. It just no longer exists as it functions, as a problem in society. It's marginalized, pushed aside. Beigeness becomes a new thing. That's the new talk of the town. It becomes the new kind of like majority group. Blackness stays on the sideline. Even if you look at the rates of intermarriage, black intermarriage is at the lowest rate. White Asian intermarriage is the highest. So it just gets sidelined. It gets left behind and doesn't get dealt with anymore.
Follow? So do you mean people who are black identifying get left behind? Or do you mean that blackness as a semantic category is getting left behind?
Great question. I mean blackness, I mean black identifying peoples. Black identifying peoples, does that mean black arts, black culture gets left behind? Absolutely not. We go to a place where black culture gets left behind in American society.
Sorry, this is also for you, Amrit. I was personally unaware of that history of like how the term "other" popped up on the census forms. Can you talk about? I'm personally just like ignorant of that history, and I'm just a little curious about what that entails and what year that came out and how that movement struck about.
Sure. So the question I think is directed about the U.S. Census Bureau, including the check all but apply option. So it's a really, it developed in the late 1990s, this movement called Generation Mix, which consisted of mostly mixed race youth who wanted boys wanted to be seen, wanted to be able to identify as mixed race and not as this or that, or this and that. And their parents who were interracially married. They wanted their kids to be able to have more choice and freedom. So this movement came in the 1990s, came around and said, okay, we want to be able to identify multiple races on the census. But if there's actually two camps here. One part of this movement said I want to be able to acknowledge multiple races. One said I just want to be able to call myself multiracial. There's a distinction between those two. Multiracial is saying more in the vein of I want to be post-racial, not a part of race. The Chuck would apply more saying, okay, well, I want to be able to acknowledge, how I'm not a product of multiracialism. And it's a really, I think it's still on the table in a lot of ways for being taken off the census. Has a lot of political implications, obviously. Should the U.S. Census be a site for individualism, for example, or is it about politics? It brings a lot of issues because how do you now measure racial disparities, racial inequalities with statistical measurements when you can no longer distinguish who is being identified as who? So that's a problem.
Hi, I have a question, and I'm going to try to word this right, but follow me here. Pertaining to the issue, or I guess the subject of multiracialism, are we going on the terms of what society wants to happen with multiracialism, as in moving past, I guess, the problem of blackness, or are we going with what actually is happening, which is blackness still functioning regardless of what they want it to? Because if you're trying to move away from something, it means you still have some conflict or tension with it. Therefore, you need to hide it. So, I want to understand like that right there. You're talking about what society wants versus what's actually happening, and also my second, I guess, question here is multiracialism and pertains to this whole debate of post-blackness, of either post-blackness erasing blackness or expanding blackness. So you have on the other side of the debate that multiracialism is actually expanding blackness. So I want to know if you touch on both of those there.
Second one's a great question. The thing about the second part is that the expanding of blackness is a marginal placement. So we even see this in academic terrains. Afro-Latina, Afro-Black, Black Caribbean space is now developing in intellectual discourses, trying to incorporate different experiences and representations of blackness. So I think that's cool. I think it's great, but it's a marginal discourse, a marginal kind of rise. And your first question was, who is it that's framing multiracialism in what way? So when I talk about multiracialism as being a post-black project, I'm talking about people who advocate for multiracialism. So those who advocate on behalf of race mixing, interracial sex, interracial dating, interracial marriages, and mixed race subjectivities. Suggesting that those are progressive things, good things, positive things. Now, do know that's not necessarily those mixed race subjects who are doing so. Okay, oftentimes that can be someone who identifies very comfortably as a white man in power, saying it's so cool that we're dating cross-racial lines now. I'm just so cool that you guys are. And I can give you an example of myself. So my parents who engage in an interracial marriage, they themselves don't look at their marriage as if it is a representation of a post-racial, like, triumphant victory. They battle a lot against racial formations and just histories, not cultural difference in the way that I would call it, but just battling the fact that they're identified as different racial groups, and battling the fact that my father's parents, as Indians, don't like that he married a black woman. That does not mean, though, that people who look at that relationship are not thinking, oh, how great they beat race. No, it's a battle against race. That answers the question.
I have a question for Ben, because the whole human and binary things, I don't really set my mind in that direction yet, and so all this stuff is thrown around, so I want to just ask you, you kind of touched on it, you had like the LeBron picture, and you said I think it was the imperial biopower, right? So including racism, capitalism, all these things, right? And so I'm thinking about just places currently and in the past that I see it, and it's like college and professional, high school athletics, you know, the use of women as object, where they're kind of, their bodies, their diets, the very things they can do with their body is regulated like it's some sort of, it's like the Westminster show, essentially. The labor force, you know, people are being processed as they're processing foods. I just saw that there was a sniper in Iraq who was killed recently, I guess this week or last week, and wrote a book talking about how he killed over 160 people. It was a bestseller, he was celebrated. And on Fox, he said, like, how I did it was because I thought I was hungry. I just didn't consider them to be humans. Right? So you talk about that, and I'm just like, damn. Right? So I just want to know if you could share any other examples or from your research or currently that you see that kind of speak to that empirical relationship.
Yeah, hunting is actually a really interesting place to look for this stuff. There's also an awesome book called Hunting in Harlem, fiction, a novel, that I think kind of gets at a lot of this stuff as well. And recently a friend of mine was telling me about the use of like a substance inside a stag's antlers for sports enhancement, like as a sports enhancement drug, which is really interesting because the way that the hunt originally functioned as a kind of masculine ritual, where the deer's body would be hunted and then dismembered and passed around. But there are lots and lots of interesting examples, and a place where you can look is there's lots of research on colonialism's relationship with bioprospecting and the ways in which it was sort of fueled by going to foreign places and looking at foreign species, plant and animal species. One example that did come up in my research that is really interesting, and I'll try to tell it briefly, but basically in 1938, when British colonial animal welfare policy was threatening the primate trade in northern India, Columbia University's School of Tropical Medicine freaked out that they wouldn't have any monkeys to do research on, and so they imported 400 to a small island off of the coast of Puerto Rico. And they artificially landscaped this island to look like the ideal of colonial tropic place, which is not at all what the habitat was for the monkeys. And so the monkeys came and they completely destroyed the habitat and began swimming to the mainland for food. And what happened was this kind of disorganized, chaotic form of resistance actually forced the scientists to put feeding stations on the island, and this had sort of real semiotic effects because then the monkeys sort of learned to recognize humans as a part of social life. But more importantly, in terms of representations, actually what happened was when these monkeys went to the mainland, they started terrorizing villages, going into people's homes and stuff. And then when there was a huge influx of Puerto Rican immigrants to New York City, and the myth of the chupacabra in Puerto Rican culture as this monster coming into homes in Spanish Harlem and other places in New York City started taking effect, you can this is what's called an ecology of representation. You can trace that myth, that character of the chupacabra, this idea of this monster coming into homes, to the escape of these monkeys in Cayo Santiago, the island off of Puerto Rico. So that's just one example of where you see the relationship between colonialism and animalization and racism are sort of kind of bound up, but there's lots of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so you pose it, for this one for you, and so you pose at the end, what are the, how do you craft mythologies of liberation? And so what I was thinking, so I'm going to give a response to that and maybe give your feedback, but I think for me, it relies in black theology. And so sort of things that I was thinking about was that, so James Cone came out with a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and where you see sort of the black body confined with the Christian tradition of Christ. And so I feel like there's a sense of effect in the sense that you can share the experience with Christ, which is sort of, to be supernatural beyond sort of things. And so for me, like I was thinking of the human and the sense of like having a noose wrapped around you, and to see a white man's eyes, and to sort of see their own civilization and what it means to be civilized and human, when you're sort of doing to your own hand, like putting a noose around them and you know, lynching them. That kind of thing can be something where you can feel, you can find your humanity and your civilization with. And so I think for black individuals, we find a lot of connection with the religion and with the church is finding liberation. So I think that's where we find our liberation. For me personally, that's how I found my liberation. And I know there's some problematic issues with sometimes religion and the issues that, you know, blacks experience with that, but I feel like there's also liberation. And for me, I'm currently a missionary here in Chicago, and I told them that, like, what do you want to do? Like, what's your mission? I'm like, I want to work on racism. I want to dismantle racism. And the reason why I said that is because I want to find my own liberation. And so black theology is being, a mythology for that liberation. And so I just want to hear your response.
Well, so I think that as you're saying you're doing right now, that I mean, black theology definitely, and you're talking about black Christian theology, right? So black Christian theology definitely can be used and purposed perhaps to dismantle racism, but I guess I wouldn't definitely categorize that as a new and a broad methodology of liberation, because it assumes that all black subjects identify as Christian, or that they should, or that they will one day. And so I guess I think that that's an interesting avenue. You mentioned the supernatural, and I think that there may be some interesting, that's an interesting place to look, is outside the kind of Western secularism that we're stuck in now. But I would be weary of like finding the answer in black Christian theology just because of its kind of troubled history with black non-Christians, with black queer subjects, all sorts of things like that. Callum?
I have a question. I'm trying to figure out the best way to frame it. It's kind of for you, Ben, and Paul. And I don't know, well, I was able to sit in on one of the classes, but I don't know if you guys almost realized, but it seems like your two pieces are very much in conversation with each other through the usage of Fanon, but also really for trying to articulate what the Western imagination of the black subject could be. But it almost seems like where Paul ends is where you start to pick up in your piece, Ben. And I kind of just wanted to tease out one particular thing that you talked about, Paul, which is you suggest, or you're urging us to move beyond the institution, right, in order to begin to, I guess, disentangle what is justice. But it seems as if the institution is your sole basis of making the conditions for justice, right? So I guess what I'm trying to figure out then is where you're positing this quote-unquote black subject, because different times, and I don't know if you meant to do this or not, but at some points you say that the body is not recognized at all. And then at other points in time you say that the body is just particularly controlled or subjected or made perverse. And so I guess I'm just trying to really find out why that is. And I guess the way that leads to where Ben is at in his research is where he ended up talking about just how we don't have necessarily language. Both of you guys are articulating specific ways in which the Western imagination imagines for black subjects. So I don't know, maybe you could further talk about it out a little bit, or I guess maybe entertain what the idea of how the black subject might be able to understand itself.
So, if I understand correctly, you're saying, well, there's a lot there. Let me just, I don't think if I did, I misspoke. I don't think I meant that the body's not recognized. No. All that is governed is the body. So the book that I referenced a while ago is Birth of the Clinic. Does more work on the concept of biopower, which and our projects are very connected. I cut off part of my project because it was getting into his direction and it wasn't as good. that biopower, it's not about, we're not governing people. We're not governing persons or selves, persons. That is to say, you know, this corpus, this thing here, which will die and be put in, you know, which will just die, whatever, is not a spiritual element outside of some sort of spiritual system. The person is a legal concept by which the body is governed. So that's why I said this is the birth of politics, wherein everyone gets to govern themselves, but not really. But that's not to say that it's any different than what was before. So there's a concept called rupture and redouble, where you think something is different, it actually comes back and redoubles onto the thing you thought it was different than. That is to say, there's always a person or a spiritual concept, a higher concept than the flesh in religion. The carnal has to be governed by the spiritual. Wherefore, if everything is carnal, there needs to be a king that is more spiritual than all others so that it can govern it, right? There needs to be reason, thought, direction, right? And so it's not that the person is not being acknowledged, the body is not being acknowledged, it's the body is not being attached to a person, much like a human. So there's the person, and then there's the human person. I'm saying body, why I say only black bodies, or why I don't say black persons necessarily, because all bodies are governed, including the animal body. And then just as a second, what I think was your second point, which is the person, it's not that the institution is my basis. I've said that there's a bifurcation between the institution and the not, politics and the not. And why I use deconstruction is because I'm trying to tease out how it's always already the other. Meaning the political is not politics. The institution is not the institution. The institution is always more than itself.
Yeah. I don't know.
This is for Paul. And really, I think Ben could probably speak to this as well. So you both talk a lot about bodies, and you're both sort of on to a discussion around race and thinking through the kind of history of race. But I'm wondering if you can, what's missing from your analysis for me is any sort of concern about territories or global spaces in relationship to the Constitution of Europe, right? So maybe you could speak to that. How it is that we talk about race without privileging the body and without privileging the somatic.
Yeah. Well, shortly, I'm working with a framework in the hermeneutics of the subject by Foucault, and then just some basic property law. So that I just called up my sister and asked her, hey, is this actually a rule? Because someone hinted at me, and I thought that really fits into my project, that the body and land are not different. So that the body is space. Space is body. So I guess my presentation is problematic to something that might want to pay special attention to space or territories, but then maybe there is room for making an analog between the way the body is pillaged and the way that land or territories or borders or anything like that might be pillaged geopolitically. So that is to, I guess to say, I'll say this again, maybe between the body and space, not to say that they're not different and they don't deserve different attentions, but maybe they're always already the other in the sense that where the body goes, I bring a geopolitics with me. So my suggestion was that I'm bringing the jungle with me at all times. I bring the jungle into the boardroom. And where I might be a little upset about somebody touching my hair, right? This Pandora's box, worlds clash. Again, another example would be the clash of civilizations, not being between two necessary distant spaces, but the clash of civilization that takes place in a line at the airport over someone's body to do this to someone. So that is, you know, Iraq or Iran right there in the border.
Yeah, I guess I would add, I think that the example that I was explaining to Dallas, like, it does, I think you're right that territory is a big part of it, and does deserve to be discussed. And I think that what you see in the example I told about Puerto Rico is that, I mean, there were ecosystemic changes that happened through British colonialism, where monkeys were brought from northern India to Puerto Rico. But I also think that territory is a big part of it in the ways in which we conceptualize property and its relationship to race and species as well, or animality. We know that, for example, in English forest law, for example, like created these woodland regions. They were territorial spatial formations where everything within was kind of a wild ecosystem, sort of untouched, but it was still the property of the king. So anyone who went in there, a lower class person, for example, for food hunting, they were not allowed to hunt the animals there because the animals there were reserved for the monarch. Not for the monarch to look at, for the monarch to hunt. So they were just basically these territorial killing fields for deer. And what you see is that space and territory is being used to define bodies. So it's being used to define, once a deer is inside the space, it's the property of the king, and once it's outside the space, it's not. And so I do think that territory has a central role in the way that race intersects with specifically property, but colonialism at large as well.
For the last speaker, what's your name?
Okay.
I wanted to know who is being viewed as an animal and what does that mean? Because I think that in your talk I was confused as to who was being viewed as an animal, who was doing the viewing, and then like your example that you just used, I'm not sure that that was who you were saying was the viewer initially. So I just want to be clear about what all of that means.
Yeah. So do you mean through like in animalization?
Yeah. Who is doing the viewing? Who's the voyeur? And then who is?
So with the racializations, like for Brer Rabbit or King Kong, for example, those I would argue there's a white voyeur. But at the same time, like if you can remember the King Kong, like King Kong's looking right back. And so the viewer is also being viewed. And the voyeurism involved in assigning animal status or human status is really complicated and is definitely a big part of it. I just didn't have time to cover it today. But in the animalization scenarios, I would argue that the voyeur occupies a white positionality.
So then the person being viewed, how does that then, who are the people being viewed that you were speaking of then? Who are the humans or the people that were categorized as less than human? And then what does that mean for that group?
Okay, so for like the King Kong example, the image of the gorilla was used historically for both Irish and black subjects. So the Irish groups and racialized black groups were the ones being viewed, and I guess the effect that it would have, I mean, we're still experiencing the effect, as you saw with the magazine that was next to King Kong, but they perpetuate some of the ideas that Paul were mentioning about a brutish black body. They perpetuate Enlightenment and colonialist ideology about savagery and irrationality, because when you use an animal to figure a racialized subject, as I've demonstrated, you're drawing on what has been attached to an animal as a kind of irrational, base, machinic body. I think we have one more question.
Yeah, you talked in your talk about sort of humanization as a social process, as an interaction between two people. But I noticed the main text you chose was Descartes, and I was wondering if you saw, since during the time he was writing, there was this big tradition of Catholic mysticism and sort of emphasizing humanity's unique access to the mind-body dualism to non-physical existence. So I wonder if you saw any interplay, because in sort of non-religious texts, but in the other religions that I'm aware of, that quality of man having a specifically unique access to non-physical existence is a specifically Christian idea. And sort of, I was wondering if you saw, did that reaffirm the binary, or how did that interact with sort of the other binary that you're discussing of socializing to becoming man, and then having access to non-physical existence being man?
Right, so the social process of becoming man comes from Hegel, actually. And Descartes was operating at a time when the most prevalent discourse was of becoming human through study, through liberal education. And I think that many of the ideas that, I mean, what you're getting at is what has been called since human exceptionalism. The idea that humans are an exceptional body, species body. And I think that that has a lot to do. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with the ways in which he theorized the self-enclosed, discrete self with a rational soul. But it also had to do with capability. So he was also theorizing that not necessarily all men would make use of the rational soul, but they were the only ones capable of it. They were the only ones capable of employing it. So does that help answer your question? Yeah. That's it. Sorry, but yeah, sorry. That's all we have.